Let me show you a clean DaVinci workflow that keeps your edits cinematic without breaking your grade every time you tweak it. Let's get into it. If you want to save time, download my free Car Videographer editing pack. It includes DaVinci Resolve project templates, node trees, and export settings so you can keep a clean, consistent workflow while you're editing. First, I go through all of my footage and pull the clips I know I might use. Then I drop those into a select bin. In this project, a lot of the clips were shot at 60 frames per second, and I'm editing on a 29.97 timeline. So before I start cutting, I interpret those clips to 29.97 in clip attributes. That gives me clean slow motion right away. Next, I drop in the music track. Then I mark the beats and use those as a guide for the rough cut. From there, I scrub through the clips, find the best part of each shot, set in and out points, and start building the timeline. As I'm doing that, I'm thinking about flow. I want shots to connect through movement, direction, or a clean visual handoff. I'm also thinking about momentum. I want the sequence to build, not just feel like random clips stacked together. For the drone shots, I usually bring them closer to normal speed, then slow them slightly if I want smoother movement. Once the rough cut is working, I move into the fine cut. This is where I tighten timing, trim frames, swap shots, and clean up the pacing. If a clip that I'd slowed down starts to break apart, I'll switch the retime process to optical flow and test what gives the cleanest result. After that, I move into framing and stabilization. For most gimbal shots, I handle stabilization on the edit page. If I need more control, especially on tougher shots or speed ramps, I'll go into Fusion. I usually start with translation or similarity and adjust from there. I also keep the render cache set to user so I can cache clips when playback starts slowing down. Once the edit feels solid, I move into color. I'm using a node-based workflow in DaVinci YRGB with DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate as my working space. I also keep 3D LUT interpolation set to tetrahedral because I find the quality is just a lot better. Then I group clips by camera type so each camera gets its own input transform before everything lands in the same working space. For Sony A7 IV footage shot in S-Log3, I use a color space transform from Sony S-Gamut3 Syn and S-Log3 into DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. For the drone footage, which was shot on a DJI Mini 4 Pro using D-Log-M, I'll use another transform node from D-Gamut and Rec 709 into DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. Before I make final color decisions, I turn proxies off and view the footage at full quality if my system can handle it. The first thing I do is adjust exposure, usually with the HDR global wheel. Then I add contrast, setting my pivot around 0.336, and I'll add a little midtone detail, about 10. From there, I'll shape the image with the primary wheels. Once exposure and contrast feel right, I add a gentle S-curve in the next node. I like doing this in a separate curves node because it gives me more control over how the contrast rolls off through the image. And when I add handles to the curve, I can shape the shadows and highlights more gradually instead of forcing a hard contrast move. That helps the blacks feel richer without getting crushed, and it helps the highlights stay bright without turning harsh. So instead of just adding contrast, I'm controlling how the image eases into the shadows and rolls off into the highlights. Now that I have a good foundation, I'll start refining color. I'll usually check saturation before white balance because it helps me see color casts more clearly. For saturation, I like using a separate node with the color space set to HSV. Then I isolate the saturation channel by turning off channels 1 and 3, and that gives me more control over how the saturation responds. If I want to adjust the overall saturation, I can work that through the gamma wheel. If I want to control the hotter or more saturated parts of the image, I can use the gain wheel. That gives me a cleaner way to shape saturation without pushing everything evenly. Then I'll move into white balance. There are a few ways to do this in Resolve, but lately I've been using chromatic adaptation when I want precise control. And the reason I like it is because it lets you define the source illuminant and the target illuminant more intentionally instead of just pushing temperature and tint until it feels close. That can be especially useful when the image is almost right but feels a little off. So the way that it works is target illuminant is what you had your white balance set to on your camera, and source illuminant is what you want to adjust it to. The very first node in my node tree is for noise reduction. That node is the first one in my tree, but I usually leave it off until the end because it's heavy on performance. Once the primary grade feels good, I'll move into the look. And this is where I'll add look nodes across the group. And a lot of the time that includes LUTs before the final output transform. The point here is not to force a look onto the footage. It's to unify the footage so the whole sequence feels like it belongs together. After that, I move into the secondary grade. This is where I start finessing the shot and try to create some separation from the car and the background. Usually this will consist of an inverted power window, and using the global HDR wheel will lower the exposure to create a vignette. I'll also add a power window with a little bit of sharpening. And if I need more depth, I'll use a gradient to darken the foreground. I also have all these set up as parallel windows, so that way they can be applied independently. Then I'll clean up any problem areas. A lot of times that means desaturating the blacks, and how I'll do this is I'll isolate the darker parts of the image, clean up the key, and use saturation versus saturation in the curves window to pull that saturation down just a little bit. It's subtle, but it helps the shadows feel cleaner and more controlled. Once that's done, I'll move into finishing effects. Usually that includes glow and split tone. With glow, I'm just trying to soften or contain the highlights a little and sometimes bring a little life back into the paint, especially on white cars. But this is definitely one of those tools that gets ugly fast if you push it too hard. Same thing with split tone. I'm usually using it to create a little more separation between warmth and coolness and add that final bit of polish. I also keep protect neutrals checked so the image will maintain its original color tone. Then the final node is what I call trim, and this is just the last cleanup pass. It's where I'll go back in mainly with the HDR wheels and tighten up anything that feels slightly off. Maybe the shadows need a little more shape, maybe the highlights are running a little hot. Then I'll come back to noise reduction. For temporal noise reduction, I'll usually start with 3 frames, set it to better, use medium motion estimation, and then adjust from there. What I'm looking for is the point where it starts helping without making the image feel plastic. That's really the balance. If you overdo it, the shot starts to feel fake very quickly. So I'll find the point where it helps and then I'll stop. I also like saving that as a shared node so I can update or toggle it across similar clips without going one by one. That saves a lot of time. Once the hero shot is fully dialed in, I'll save it as a still and apply it to the matching shots. One important tip here is to make sure you're applying color only, not all settings, because if you apply everything, you can overwrite tracking data and lose stabilization work you already did. And that is a brutal fix if you catch it late. From there, the rest of the grade usually goes much faster. At that point, I'm mostly checking window sizes, making sure that things are lined up correctly, adjusting exposure, checking white balance, and making a few smart refinements. Most clips do not need a full rebuild. They just need a few good adjustments. And if I'm matching footage from different cameras, like drone footage, like DJI footage and Sony footage, I'm still using the same general process. Match exposure first, match white balance, use the scopes as a guide. Then for the final export, I'll set my in and out points and move over to the delivery page. I'll change my timeline settings to 4K, even though I edited on a 1080 timeline. Then I'll export a master in Apple ProRes 422HQ, and that becomes my master file. From there, I'll bring it into Handbrake and make an H.264 version for YouTube. That gives me a much smaller file while still holding really solid quality, which makes the upload process a lot easier. And that's my full workflow for editing a car video start to finish in DaVinci Resolve. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to skip the guesswork, go to my website, andrewcoopervideo.com, and download the free Car Videographer editing pack. It includes my node tree setup, workflow templates, and export settings, so you don't have to start from scratch. And if this video helped you level up, drop a like, subscribe, and I'll keep breaking this stuff down for you. My name is Andrew Cooper. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.